Good to be with you this morning. Glad that Jeff and Gene had the opportunity to travel up north and visit with the church there and also visit with his mother. Certainly miss him when he's gone, and I think we oftentimes don't realize how blessed we have to have Jeff with us to present lessons and guide us in our studies and so on. So certainly appreciate that. Want to call out Sean's effort on Wednesday night in the short talk. Really good thoughts about David and courage, David and his fight against Goliath, and was kind of thinking about those things. I want to kind of revisit that a little bit this morning, kind of go back and give some thoughts to what happened there. If you still have your Bibles at 1 Samuel chapter 17, be a good idea to keep your finger there because we're going to keep coming back to that this morning. I want to share with you, I guess the title of the lesson this morning is Got Any More Giants? And this is a lesson that I used at Lake Anna about 3 years ago, so those from Lake Anna may remember this, but I already apologized to JR, and I think Heather's online, so I apologize to her and anybody else from Lake Anna, but it was 3 years ago, so it's okay, I'm allowed to use it again. But it's some really good things to think about here, and as we contemplate what happened on that day, I want to share this picture with you. So this is actually a picture of the Elah Valley. So this is an aerial shot of the Elah Valley where these events transpired. And this is from the west, looking to the east. And so as we look at this picture, you might visualize on the left-hand side of the screen, the Israelite army, the Israelites gathering their army. And you can see there's a brook or a stream that runs down the middle of the valley. And so the Israelites were on the left side of the screen, they're left side of the picture, and the Philistines were on the right, where that green mountain with the trees is located. And so the two armies came together to fight. And as we think about the events of that day, I want to think with you about the fact that David fought a monster. He fought a giant of a man. And I just in kind of setting the stage for this, I was thinking this morning in preparation, how tall was this man? This man was like 9.5 feet tall, 6 feet in a span. So that's like 9.5 feet tall. So if you think about this speaker up here, I'm not quite 6 feet, so would be the height of that speaker. So this giant that David went out against, he was a monster. He was a giant. And I want to suggest to you, as we consider these things this morning, that there are giants among us too. In our day, we don't have to go out and fight a battle against another army. We don't have to go fight some guy that's almost 10 feet tall, but there are giants among us too. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 17. I want to start reading here in verse 1. 1 Samuel 17, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Soka, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Soka and Azekah and Ephes Dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. And that's the picture that I just showed you. And they drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. God's people in ancient times faced dreadful challenges, terrible things, frightening things. On this day, about 3,000 years ago, the people of God faced an army, a great army, in fact, the Philistine army. And that army, that Philistine army, had a terrifying giant among them. But I want to suggest to you that sometimes in life under the sun, we're faced with our monsters, with our giants that we have to deal with. What giants do we face in our lives today? Different things for different people. For some folks, losing their job is a terrifying thing to contemplate. You've got a family to support. You're trying to make payments on your bills, your house, your car, whatever it is that you're paying off. You lose your job. There's no severance, no pension. You're just done. There's no notice. Scary thought for a lot of folks. There are giants among us. We all know family and friends and brethren who have difficulties. I recently posted on my Facebook page an article. It's a GoFundMe account for David Lindsay, a brother in Christ that we knew in North Florida, and his liver failed him. Not due to alcohol, just natural causes apparently, but they had to do a liver transplant. And it's just, he has the information about it there. It's a terrible thing. It's a giant that he's having to face in his life. And I'm sure we all know folks that have had to deal with illnesses and sickness, and how about the loss of loved ones, death? These things can be terrifying. When COVID came out, a lot of people were terrified by COVID. Cancer is terrifying. My dad, the last couple of weeks, as I shared, has been suffering more than normal. He's in the hospital even now. And last night, late in the day, my stepmother messaged me, and she said, he's having problems. He's coughing again, and it's so painful that he's holding his chest and, not knowing, is he having a heart attack? Is it just pain from the coughs? Not knowing those things is terrifying. Difficult things that we face, the loss of a loved one, the loneliness after the loss of a loved one. God's people in ancient times, they had their challenges, and we have our challenges today as well. So there are giants among us too. And I want to suggest to you, not only are there giants among us, they're terrifying. In verse 3 of 1 Samuel 17, the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. In verse 11, we're told that the people were greatly afraid. They were terrified. They were scared to death. But wait, what terrifying things had happened to God's people at this point? The army that had come up against them was gathered there. How many thousands of people have been killed among God's people? None yet. What terrifying things have happened to God's people so far? Well, the army's gathered there. They're yelling at us. They're cursing us. It's frightening. How many people have died? Well, we haven't started the battle yet. How many people have been injured? None yet. God's army, God's people, the great nation of Israel that God had brought out of Egypt, brought them through the 10 plagues, brought them through the Red Sea on dry land, brought them into the promised land after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and guiding them every day through those 40 years. They're terrified, and nothing's happened yet. Sometimes I want to suggest to you the prospect of danger is worse than facing the danger itself. But what is that? It's just a lack of faith. But the bad guys, they do have a champion. One man, one giant, one monster of a man. And I guess if your army has one monster, I guess that's enough. One big, tough, scary guy. Apparently that's plenty to terrify an entire army if you package him right, if you market him correctly, if you promote him the right way. And we're learning here in 1 Samuel 17, this man, Goliath of Gath, knew how to market himself. He had a mouth on him. And I suspect he had been terrifying people for a long time, and he had developed that into a fine art. Look at the description here, starting in verse 4, of this man Goliath. Verse 4 of 1 Samuel 17. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. This guy was 10 foot tall, nearly 10 foot tall. He was scary looking. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's about 125 pounds. That's just the man's armor, 125 pounds. Verse 6, he also had bronze greaves on his legs, covering his legs, armor on his legs out of bronze, a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. I don't know if you've ever seen a weaver's beam. It's pretty big. And that's what this guy's spear was like. The head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. That's 16 pounds. The spear was huge. His shield carrier also walked before him. This guy was so big and he had so much stuff, he needed a regular guy to carry his gear for him. You want to see what a giant looks like? This is Yao Ming. Some people say he's a freak of nature. 7 foot, 6 inches tall. He's a Chinese basketball player. And if you think about it, he can probably just walk right up to the basket and just dunk the ball, almost without jumping. Here's another picture of Yao Ming, the tallest in the NBA at his time, when he was playing, and the shortest in the NBA, Earl Boykins, who was 5 foot 5 inches tall. And remember, Goliath was 2 feet taller than this guy. Goliath was scary. There's no question about it. He was a giant. He was a monster. I don't know how he could even move with all that stuff that he carried, but he would have been frightening. But isn't the real issue here in this account that we read about David and the people of God, isn't the real issue whether we trust God to deliver us or not? Will we fight our own battles or will we seek help from the God of heaven and earth? That's what we're talking about. And we need to understand that the enemy uses words to attack us and to weaken us. And again, Goliath is a master at this. Let's pick up here in verse 8. 1 Samuel 17, verse 8. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." Again, the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Remember who Saul was? Saul was their king. And I want to suggest to you, Saul was apparently a giant among men as well. You remember when Saul was selected, he stood head and shoulders above all the others. He was a pretty big guy himself, and he was a pretty valiant warrior. But you see, our enemies use words to attack us and to weaken us. And they know they don't even have to fight us if they scare us enough with their words. Remember the 12 spies that Israel sent out to spy out the promised land when they were at the doorsteps to the land of Canaan? Do you remember God told Moses to pick out the 12 spies, to pick 12 leaders from among the people? They were leaders from the 12 tribes. You remember what happened? 2 of the leaders of the people came back and presented a good report of the land, but 10 presented a bad report. And think with me about the report that we got from these 10 leaders. We'll come back to 1 Samuel 17, but I want to look at Numbers 13. Do you remember that the fruit of the land was so plentiful that when the spies sought to bring back a bunch of grapes, they had to tie it to a pole, and it took 2 men to carry it? In Numbers 13, picking up in verse 26, we read, "They proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. And they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Thus they told him and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. They brought back samples of the fruit of the land, just like God said. Everything was just as God told us. The land is flowing with milk and honey. Oh, yes, it's a rich, rich land, just like God said. But they didn't stop there. Pick up in verse 28 of Numbers 13. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land, they're strong. The cities, they're fortified, and they're very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Whoa, the sons of Anak, those are giants. We can't take those guys. They're huge. They're giants. Verse 29, Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country. And the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we will surely overcome it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against this people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land which we have gone in, spying out, is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw are men of great size. They're giants, right? There also we saw the Nephilim. The sons of Anak are part of the Nephilim. And we became like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. Giants and grasshoppers. Words of discouragement and faithlessness. God had been leading them every day for 40 years. They had the pillar of fire by night. They had the pillar of cloud by day. When the cloud moved, they moved. When the cloud stopped, they stopped. For 40 years, God led them. Brought them through the sea, the Red Sea, on dry land. Now they're saying, well, I know God said we could go in, but we can't. And so their words discouraged the people of God. And by the way, they ended up spending 40 years wandering in the wilderness as punishment. The enemy uses words to attack us and to weaken us. But you know what's interesting? Words of defiance motivate the man or woman of faith. Let's go back to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Look at David's response to the words and threats of Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, verse 20. David rose up early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the trench as the host was going forth to the fight and shouted for the battle. There's a lot of shouting going on. But you see, the Israelites and the Philistines, they're not fighting yet. They're just shouting at each other. Verse 21, for Israel and the Philistines had put the battle in array, army against army. And David left his carriage in the hand of the keeper of the carriage and ran into the army and came and saluted his brethren. And as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the army of the Philistines, and spoke according to the same words. This time it's a little different. And David heard them. David hears the words of the champion of the Philistines. And look at David's response. Well, first look at the response of David's countrymen in verse 24. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him, and they were sore afraid. But remember, he comes out cursing and yelling. Words are what are being used against God's people, and words are what will be used against us today. They're terrifying. They're scary. Look at verse 25. The men of Israel said, have you seen the man that's come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up, and it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. The guy that kills that giant, he won't have to pay taxes, and he's going to marry the princess. Why do you think that they share this information about the king's reward with David? I don't know what you think about this, but I kind of get the sense it's almost like they're grasping at straws, trying to find somebody that'll pick up the challenge and go fight this guy. Anybody. Will anybody go fight him? And again, King Saul had a reputation as a valiant warrior. Remember, they used to sing songs about what a great warrior he was. Where was his faith? The man who was selected to be king over the nation. It was his job to go out. He didn't go out. He didn't send his son out. Verse 26 of 1 Samuel 17, then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? I want to suggest to you, when David hears the taunts of the giant, it infuriates him. It motivates him. He's motivated by this defiance. And I want to suggest to you, David's words are fighting words. This is the right response. Who is this guy? He's challenging the army of God. He's challenging God himself. Goliath's words terrified everybody else, but they actually motivate this great man of faith. Who will speak against God and his people in this way? David's not having it. But you can almost see the people light up. Hey, we got a live one here. Take this guy to King Saul. We might have somebody willing to go out and take this monster on. Picking up in verse 31 of 1 Samuel 17, when the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. But I want to suggest to you, words of defiance, they motivate the man or woman of faith. And the man or woman of faith trusts in God. And that's the great example that we have in David. Here's another picture of the brook Elah. This is close to where this battle took place. This is the brook where the battle was fought. I thought it was interesting. There's obviously a lot of stones there in the brook. I had one stone that I found when we lived in Tucson. It wasn't huge, but it was a good size. But that thing was so heavy. It's just incredible. And I read an article several years ago. This writer was saying, he was a gun writer, and he writes articles about guns and firearms. And he was saying, he says, if you take a stone and you spin it in a sling and you hit a relatively small target, like you hit a man in the forehead with it, he said, he basically did the calculations, and he said, it's the same power from a 45 caliber bullet. And I don't know whether that's true or not. Of course, it's not going to penetrate much because it's a rock, not a bullet. But this is what David used. The man of faith trusts in God. Let's pick up in verse 40. So David goes out. Verse 40. He took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand. This is not a slingshot like what we use. This is a sling that you spin around and then you release it. And the people in this day that were using slings were very good with them. But he took his sling in his hand and he approached the Philistine. Verse 41. Then the Philistine came on and approached David and the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. How old was David? We don't know. I know in ancient times they didn't think an Israelite male became a man until he was 30. I'm guessing probably 20, 21 years old. We don't know. We're not told. But this Philistine called him out. He says, you're just a young pup. How does the monster respond here? Remember, our enemies use words to weaken us, to attack us, and they don't even have to fight us if they scare us with their words. Verse 43, the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Probably the air was pretty blue that day. The Philistine also said to David, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Well, that would be pretty terrifying to have this giant monster of a man talking that way to you. But look at David's response here. Again, the words of defiance motivated him. Verse 45, David said to the Philistine, you come to me with the sword and a spear and a javelin, But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. I want to remind you, I don't know if you remember this or not, but when Saul questioned David and said, you can't go against this guy. You're just a youth. He's been a soldier. He's been training for battle since his youth. David said, when I was out keeping the sheep and there was a bear that came to try to take the sheep, I grabbed him and I killed him. When there was a lion that came to take the sheep, I grabbed him by his beard and I killed him. And he said, this uncircumcised Philistine, he won't be any different. God protected me from the bear. God protected me from the lion. God will give me a victory over this Philistine. That was his attitude. Look at the result here in verse 49. Well, actually, verse 48. It happened when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David. Look what David does. He ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. He's not, lagging back. He ran quickly to meet this giant. Verse 49, look at the result. David put his hand into his bag, took from it a stone, he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. They didn't even have a sword to kill a guy. He took the giant's own sword. But David trusted God. God delivered him. Something else I want to get from this, and then we'll conclude the lesson. I want to suggest to you that the faith of one individual, man or woman, the faith of one individual can save many, can have a huge impact on the people around them. Your faith can have a huge impact on the people around you. So in our account here, the man of faith is victorious, the man of God. But does the story end here? No. One man stands up against the enemies of the living God. Just one man accomplished this great victory. But look what the result is. Verse 52. 1 Samuel 17, verse 52. The men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sharam, even to Gath and Ekron. A great victory that day. The entire nation of God's people enjoy a great victory as the result of the faith of one man. But really, any single individual of the people of God could have done what David did. But none did. The king didn't do it. The king's son didn't do it. David's brothers didn't do it. David did it. The youngest among his brothers. Not a single one of the others stood up to the enemies of God like David did. And I want to suggest to you that this is part of the reason why God says this guy David was special. He was special. He was a man after God's own heart. He had faith in God. He trusted in God. That's what it means to say you have faith. I hear people all day long cry out, oh, how I love Jesus. But they don't live by that faith. They don't trust God. This man did. We need to be like David. What giants need to be slain in your life? And will you trust God? David trusted God. Will you trust God the way that David did? Wonderful lessons for us to learn here. And, again, I think oftentimes we look at these things and, it's like, wow, this was a spectacular event. But when you think about what led up to it, I mean, David led a life of faith. He attributed these victories to God. And he said, I killed the bear. I killed the lion. God gave me the victory over those. He will give me the victory over this giant, this monster as well. He trusted in God. But do we trust in God, and will we trust in God? That's the question to us today. That's why God tells us these things about these that have gone on before us. This morning, there may be some here that have never rendered obedience to the gospel of Christ. If you've never confessed Christ before people, if you've never made an effort to turn from your sins, if you've never been baptized in the waters of baptism to have your sins washed away, you can do that. That's not a terrifying thing to do. Maybe it seems like it, but it's really not that bad. But if you've never done those things, you could do those things today. We could help you to do those things today. If you have done those things in times past and you've not been living your life right, God is giving you the opportunity to make any changes that you need to make today. But God does not promise you a tomorrow. If we can help you to get your life right in any way, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that was selected.
Jesus, draw me